As the previous video installation had laid out all of the general conditions and circumstances of the unfolding operation by 6 a.m., as by now the Combat Engineer Battalion, having had wrapped up its combat operations while crossing the First Canal, had also allowed for the advance of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion across the First and Second Canal, where they had stopped upon crossing the Second Canal to conduct a brief logistical topping off operation as they awaited for the Combat Engineer Battalion to wrap up its combat operations along the First Canal. The U.S. Army Reserve Forces and the Carl Pipkins Army Reserve Center, by this point in time, had been reeling from total abject pandemonium caused by the combination of not just the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and usage of electronic warfare assets against their ISR and communications capabilities, which already had thrown them into the Stone Age, proverbially speaking, but also the demolition charges having had been planted by Chinese MSS, Pakistani ISI, and Iranian Ministry of Intelligence agents in motor pools and on key buildings had added to this total and complete chaos having had erupted throughout the American military installations inside of Beaumont, as also with the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade having had launched a total of 8 tactical ballistic missiles, 4 apiece of the DF-11As and DF-15Bs, having had struck key targets in these installations, being followed up by 2 a.m. by further strikes on the same sites by Russian Club K and Chinese YJ-18C container-disguised cruise missile systems, as these systems were now firing their first salvos 2 hours into the invasion. The total, absolute devastation caused by all of this, in conjunction with the use of the YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missiles and the USUN undersea loitering munitions against all American shipping, followed up by the massive cruise missile barrage coming from the Renhai-class guided missile cruisers and the Yuan-class subs on most local bridges, save for a very small number of strategically vital bridges, had led to American forces being effectively cut off and surrounded within the city of Beaumont as they wallowed again in abject pandemonium caused by the earlier devastating strikes. By now, as travelers, having had already been on the roads by the time of the start of the invasion, as well as now being joined by refugees from other areas, now seeing the sights of the enemy forces for the first time, had essentially reported to American military personnel as they moved through the area that they had seen the Chi-Com invasion forces, and thus the lieutenant colonel, which was the commander of the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion, and his executive officer, or XO, a major, had put together a tiny scratch force of 4 M113 armor personnel carriers that were staffed by a squad pulled from each of the 4 companies comprising the 373rd, as the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion was comprised of its headquarters and headquarters company, the 103rd Quartermaster Company, the 242nd Quartermaster Company, and the 1002nd Quartermaster Company, with also the 310th Quartermaster Detachment with these 4 companies comprised the entire 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion, as one section or squad from the headquarters and headquarters company, the 103rd, 242nd, and 1002nd had been pulled to and paired with an M113 armor personnel carrier, each given a crew serve weapon for this recon mission. They would be sent on a quick mission to the south of the Carl Pipkins Army Reserve Center and to immediately and rapidly return in order to report the rough CHICOM positions in order to ascertain this vital actionable intelligence, therefore, in order to put together the most comprehensive and rapid defense plan possible for the remaining forces that weren't annihilated in the missile strikes and demolition charge attacks, to be able to try to defend their area or their AO as best as possible. And thus, acquiring actionable intelligence was more vital than ever, as again, the American forces, having had been thrown into the Stone Age, had to use primitive means, such as putting together scouting parties to make attempts to try to find where exactly the enemy was and where the enemy was moving to. And therefore, as this grouping, or a platoon-sized element of a reconnaissance force, had been put together with these 4 M113 armor personnel carriers and was sent south between 3 and 4 a.m. as the operation kicked off at 4 a.m. and they were due to return by 5 a.m. The lead company of the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade's Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, which was a ZBD-05 light tank / assault gun company, as this was the spearheading company of the entire Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, which was now, as the whole battalion was across the second of 2 canals moving northwards, had 1.5 miles away honed in on their targets with their 105 millimeter rifled tank guns aboard these assault gun / light tanks of the ZBD-05 dual-purpose vehicles, as these amphibious assault gun / light tanks were very powerful weapons indeed and had a massive range advantage due to their 105 millimeter rifled tank gun. The real-time AI battlefield data processing system, utilizing all the collected ISR data from the vehicle / squad level quadcopter assets all the way up to the high altitude recon assets to the satellite-based assets, all overlaying to map out the battlefield in real time, had seen this force leaving the Army Reserve station in real time, and as they proceeded on their course, the AI was constantly updating their position in real time on the combat data links, both in the vehicles and handheld versions carried by squad-level NCOs and up, and therefore targeting data, having had been easily ascertained and acquired, was utilized by the vehicles in this company to rapidly and methodically destroy these M113 armor personnel carriers as soon as not just being in range, but as soon as there were no obstructions in the path of these 105 millimeter shells, and therefore they were all destroyed moving south on State Highway 93, which 93 was a 4-lane state highway, but divided by a double yellow line instead of a median, whereas State Highway 96 was divided by a median. And near the junction of 93 and 96 was where these vehicles were destroyed, as the lead company of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as the whole battalion was across the second of 2 canals en route north, with the Combat Engineer Battalion by now having had by 6 a.m. wrapped up its battle with armed reactionary civilians, which occurred between 5 and 6 a.m. as they were crossing the first canal, as the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion had virtually no resistance crossing both canals by the time they had crossed the second canal, and this operation had occurred, and this force was due to return by 5 a.m., they had already been destroyed 1.5 miles away from their then current position. So therefore, between 5 and 6, a new force was put together, this time a much larger force, which was a company-sized force, putting together vehicles that remained intact from among the 4 companies and detachment that comprised the 373rd, as by now they had lost quite a few vehicles from the tactical ballistic missile strikes and the demolition charges that had been planted in the motor pools. And therefore, they had to put together a new ad hoc and company-sized rescue and recon force, as the rescue operation was to try to salvage the vehicles and survivors of the platoon-sized force that had been sent south to recon and return, and thus the new force, a company-sized force, was dispatched, as the last force didn't return by 5, between 5 and 6. By 6, they had been dispatched south to, again, recover the vehicles and any surviving crew members and bring them back to the Army Reserve Center, as well as also carry out a recon action to see where the rough positions of the PLAN Marines were at this time. So therefore, when we go to the map of the area of the junction of State Highway 96 and State Highway 93, by this time of this operation, with the company-sized force having had been put together out of the elements of the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion and the resumed advance of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as they had waited for the Combat Engineer Battalion to wrap up its battle along the First Canal, as they were also resuming their advance by 6 a.m., as so were the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion by 6 a.m. They were moving towards their objectives in the city of Beaumont, with the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion to eliminate the remaining forces on the Carl Pipkins Army Reserve Center, with the Combat Engineer Battalion to clear all the military sites along the Neches River port area in Beaumont. But in order to arrive there, there would be a small skirmish fought in the area of the highway junction of 96 and 93 by the lead company of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, which was one of its two ZBDO-5 assault gun/light tank companies. As we go to the map of the area, it was in a quasi-rural area, with part of it within city limits and part of it outside of city limits, as the battlefield was in this area, part of it out of city limits and part of it within. In the area was a sewage and water treatment plant, which actually was a lesser objective, which would, after the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion moved through, a company from the SHORAD Battalion, the Yetion Systems, would move in with their armored short-range air defense vehicles and troops and occupy and defend the sewage and water treatment plant, as the SHORAD Battalion, having absolutely no air targets, was now being used as a security force, both for supply convoys from the support battalions, transport and logistical companies, as well as also occupying key sites as a security element, which included the soon-to-become forward operating base, which was the Port Arthur Municipal Airport, as well as guarding the port facilities themselves and using the remaining companies to, again, escort logistical shipments to the forward fighting battalions, as well as also to occupy lesser sites, as there was one freed-up company from the SHORAD Battalion that would be able to occupy the sewage and water treatment plant. They would be sent in after the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion had cleared the area and moved on to their objective of the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve Center. As we go to the map, this area, being a 1 mile by 1 mile area, included an L-shaped lake that effectively continued off-map to the east. This was the shape of it, with the L protruding north, with the longer part off-map moving east and west, with other marshy and sparsely wooded areas in this particular part of the battle space. The rail lines that also moved through this area continued across a bridge over this creek, as there was a road and rail bridge, State Highway 93, and the rail line continuing north. And this, being State Highway 96, right off map and immediately off map to the north, was where the highway junction of both state highways came together, as in this point right here. So this map was effectively this area right here, as the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion moved north, being led by one of its two ZBDO-5 light tank / assault gun companies the lead spearheading company would break off into its 5 platoons, as in its 4 light tank combat platoons, or assault gun platoons, as was a light tank / assault gun amphibious, and its headquarters platoon following behind, with one platoon using its amphibious capabilities to cross this 500-meter wide lake at its widest point, or half a kilometer wide, and cross the small lake using its amphibious capabilities, while another would continue along the shore. One would continue up the highway, up State Highway 93, before moving in to clear this scaffolding / building supply company complex, before then continuing to cross the creek and take up positions after this area had been thoroughly cleared, while the platoon on the far left would sweep north on the left flank of this operation to aid in the clearance of this particular area of hostile forces. As the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, using each and every vehicle, cruise, quadcopter assets, or squad level / vehicle cruise quadcopter asset, along with the high altitude and satellite based capabilities, had seen all of these forces long before this PLAN company moved into the area from the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, and thus they had all of their movements and operations tailored according to the constantly updated maps on the combat data links, and thus the strike packages had also been put together for the aircraft involved in this very brief skirmish, as 2 J-10 fighters from one of 2 J-10 fighter squadrons would both fly in and each drop their pair of 1,000-pound precision laser-guided munitions on targets below, with even one Su-34 strike aircraft dropping an additional 2 1,000 pounds rear-to-ground munitions on armed reactionary civilian targets below. As in this particular area, the armed reactionary civilians in the cyan color coding, whereas the military forces are in more of an olive-green color coding, were standard armed reactionary civilians, as in these were armed reactionary civilians with everything from handguns and shotguns to hunting rifles, and even some with sporting rifles as well, as they were more urbanized or quasi-urbanized armed reactionary civilians, and were not the militia type of armed reactionary civilians, which were now being frequently engaged on the periphery of the city of Beaumont. These armed reactionary civilians had effectively been passing through the area, but now ran into PLAN Marine forces, who were likewise moving into and through this area as well. As 2 CH-901A loitering munitions, each one equipped with a fragmentation warhead, had been fired by 2 of the headquarters platoons, which the headquarters platoon vehicles would move into this area after these combat platoons moved ahead. They had 2 of their specially trained drone operators fire the single-tube versions of these CH-901A loitering munitions, being set to AI target-seeking mode, would hit targets across this creek on the northern edges of this 1 by 1 mile battle space, as a grouping of armed reactionary civilians were moving on the actual highway itself of State Highway 96. This was an elevated part of the highway. This here was one of the 2 access roads, this being the other one. This was the highway itself, and this grouping of armed civilians were moving through the highway, but would be hit by one of the fragmentation warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munitions, with the other one moving on to hit American military forces over on the other side of the creek, as this platoon that was now being hit by 2 1,000-pound precision-guided munitions had a few additional soldiers off the map that would barely survive this strike, which would destroy all of these vehicles, but they wouldn't survive the other loitering munition, which would continue on and hit those troops off the map, whereas This platoon-sized element of M113s had moved in on either side of State Highway 93 to provide possible fire support if needed to the crossing of their other platoon-sized elements, as this was a platoon-sized element of Max Pro MRAPs with their associated crew serve weapons, as each platoon-sized force had crew serves consisting of one each of an M2 50 cal heavy anti-materiel machine gun, a belt-fed Mark 19 40mm grenade launcher, also a 240 Bravo, which was a general-purpose machine gun which fired the 7.62 NATO caliber, which was 7.62 by 51mm, and then of course there was the M249 SAW, or the squad automatic weapon, which was a 5.56 caliber belt-fed weapon, as each vehicle and each platoon-sized element was armed with one of each of these crew serve types. The M250 cal Mark 19 were by far the two most powerful of the four mentioned crew serve weapons types, but these would essentially do very little, if anything, to the light tank / assault guns, these EBD-05s of this PLAN Marine Company moving into the area from the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion. As each platoon moved forward, this platoon moving in a wedge formation, armed civilians were already also in this business complex, the scaffolding / building supply company. There were 15 inside of this warehouse building here, and there were 10 out in the parking area. As this battle was fairly straightforward, they had moved toward the perimeter fencing and had laid down some small arms fire against this particular light tank / assault gun, which did nothing, and return fire was meted out promptly in the form of a Frag T 105mm tank shell from the 105mm rifle tank gun and 12.7mm heavy machine gun fire from the W85 heavy machine gun on the turret, which shredded dismounted personnel to absolute pieces. As this grouping of four Max Pro MRAPs was coming around the side of the property in this scattered wooded area with small ponds, it was somewhat marshy. As they moved around the side of this building, they would be fired at by the main tank guns of these light tanks of this platoon. Whereas this platoon, as this was the original recon element, having had all their vehicles destroyed from 1.5 miles away by the rifled tank guns of this very same company, as this was the platoon-sized element originally trying to be rescued by this company-sized force that had moved in now. These vehicles sitting there smoking in multiple pieces with scattered, shredded metal everywhere all around the vehicles. This platoon would move right up in between them and continue on to clear out this complex, while this platoon on the far right flank would cross this 500-meter wide small lake using their amphibious capabilities, coming out on the other side to attack the sewage and water treatment plant, which was held by this point by armed reactionary civilians, which were transitory, passing through the area, not really trying to be here, but they had been caught here effectively, while this platoon moving up along the lakeside would immediately fire upon and shred these technicals to pieces, which barely got their personnel out of the beds of the truck, who were also shredded up by a combination of heavy machine gun fire and some Frag T shells, which ripped these vehicles and personnel to pieces, as Frag T shells were outstanding against soft-skinned military or civilian vehicles, as well as dismounted personnel, and completely annihilated this grouping of vehicles and their personnel, who barely got in any shots against this single column of the ZBD-05 light tank / assault guns, now moving along the shore of the lake, while these others had crossed the lake and now disembarked on the other side and proceeded towards the rail lines as they were going to move in and clear this area, as this platoon was about to help them. As they moved forward, they laid down heavy fire against these personnel laid out along the rail line, trying to return fire against them, but as the heavy machine gun fire got more concentrated and heavier, they had begun to be ripped to pieces, as 3 squads from the 5 total vehicles would be dismounted. They would bound and cover tactically into this facility and begin to capture it from these forces here, as these these three tried to move toward the rail lines to lay down fire. They were promptly fired at by heavy machine gun fire, and then small arms fire by the troops as they disembarked, and they cut them all down. This grouping on the other side would surrender immediately and be taken as EPWs by this squad and this squad, as the squad would hold their position here to be able to lay down supporting fire if need be, while these squads moved in to effectively wrangle them up. This, of course, after these two 1,000-pound munitions landed here and destroyed these 3 technicals and 5 dismounts to the north in this parking area of the sewage and water treatment plant. As these vehicles, for now, were barely intact in terms of these M113 APCs, they would shortly thereafter be knocked out by the 105mm rifled tank guns aboard the ZBD-05 assault gun / light tanks, as they laid down fire against them after having had crossed the rail lines and entered the plant before smashing through the fence and into the parking area here. As they briefly took some fire from the crew serve weapons, they promptly knocked out these 2 M113 APCs. As these vehicles, at the opening of the map, this lead M113 had been knocked out immediately at the opening of the map by the lead ZBD-05 assault gun / light tank in this column of this platoon of 5 of those vehicle types. The others made attempts to go around the knocked out vehicle, these other 3, but they too were promptly knocked out, as before this had even occurred, the 4 dismounted squads, minus the gunners and drivers and the platoon sergeant and the second lieutenant or platoon leader of this group, had stayed in the vehicles and were destroyed in the vehicles. These 4 squads, dismounted from each vehicle, already on the north side of the creek, had crossed the bridges, and these 2 squads would move through this area here and bound in cover along the side of this warehouse building, while these 2 squads cautiously moved through this area and then begun to bound in cover while these light tanks / assault guns were moving up, and they had laid down heavy fire and destroyed these 2 squads by the time they had gotten here to this corner of this property, after already having had destroyed these Max Pro MRAPs coming around this side. As all of this action had occurred by the time these vehicles had gotten here. These vehicles were already destroyed, and so were these 2 squads. They would then continue on before briefly pausing here and then crossing the creek, this branch of it, and then the other branch, continuing to the other side. As these forces, this up-armored Humvee, which contained the captain chosen to be the task force leader of this company-sized task force, his up-armored Humvee, a HET, or heavy equipment transporter truck, and also 2 LMTV supply trucks, and the M88 armored recovery vehicle were all destroyed in this airstrike. Each of these M113s were also destroyed already in this airstrike, and these vehicles were all destroyed coming across the creek bridge, the street bridge of the highway, the State Highway 93 highway bridge across this creek. They were all destroyed after this lead vehicle was knocked out first. As they tried to go around, they were all wiped out, leading to this platoon continuing on and moving in, trying to be attacked as they move through the area by, which is what this green is, by these squads here firing against these vehicles. But as they turn to enter the parking area, they promptly cut these 2 squads down with heavy machine gun fire from their turret machine gunners. And they did this with relative ease, as there was very little in the way of cover and concealment in this particular part of the parking lot, minus a few scattered vehicles. They were all ripped to shreds. And by the time they pulled up in between these 2 buildings, this being the office and this being the warehouse, they disembarked all their squads to check these buildings. One squad would hold their position according to standard building clearance procedures outside of the office, while another squad went in and checked the office. If they were needed, they could have come in to assist, or they could cut off retreat, as their quadcopter assets were running circuits over this entire battle space and beyond of this whole company. They could see all developments as they were occurring, and therefore could respond accordingly, as everything was updated in real time on the combat data links. And as these 2 squads entered to clear this building, one squad took position waiting outside. As these two squads went in, all 15 of these armed reactionary civilians inside were all wiped out, and then the squads all re-entered their vehicles and then continued on to the edge of the property and then broke through the fencing and crossed the creek, where they dismounted two squads temporarily, whereas this platoon also temporarily dismounted two squads after driving between the freshly knocked out M113s, and they held their position temporarily there, while this platoon on the far right flank disembarked their squads, one to check this building here, one to hold their position outside, while one held their position here by the lead vehicle, another outside of this building, while this squad checked this building and this sewage and water treatment plant, while these squads were still in this area holding the enemy prisoners of war, which would soon be retrieved by the arriving company of Yitian Shorad forces, as these Yitian armored Shorad vehicles and their troops would move into the area to occupy the site. They would take responsibility of the EPWs and then send them down to the new forward operating base that was being developed at the Port Arthur Municipal Airport, where there was also a temporary enemy prisoner of war camp being established already at this time for all captured prisoners throughout the battle space to be sent to, and that included those who surrendered in this area here. As this area had been thoroughly cleared out, and there had been relatively light combat inside of this building, as there were only 15 armed reactionary civilian combatants inside, they were promptly wiped out, and none opted to surrender, at least inside of the warehouse building, which would lead to the remounting up of the PLAN Marines, re-entering their vehicles, their ZBD-05 assault gun / light tanks, and continuing on their advance. As again, this was a relatively short 40-minute long skirmish. In fact, it was so short that artillery fire missions weren't even called in to assist in this operation, as the airstrikes were more than enough, as virtually two platoon-sized elements, in terms of the numbers of personnel, were outright annihilated by the airstrikes, with the ZBD-05s and their affiliated squads eliminating the rest of the personnel in the area, or capturing them in the case of those that surrendered in the sewage and water treatment plant. As they temporarily held their positions after the 40 minutes had elapsed, they would all remount up in their vehicles and rejoin the entire convoy formation, as the rest of the battalion would move in single file up the State Highway 93, where they would continue until getting off on 4th Street and other local streets in the area to surround the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve site, which would occur by 7 o'clock, or roughly between 7 and 7:05. As this skirmish was going on between 6 and 6:40, by that time, the Combat Engineer Battalion was making good headway deep into the city, where they encountered light resistance en route to the main port facilities. As they moved into the area, they moved through some of the downtown of Beaumont as they moved towards the port facilities. As we go to the map of the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation along the Neches River port area of Beaumont, this area was effectively a walled-off or fenced-off area that contained the major energy companies that had a huge footprint in this area, as this was the Neches River, as this was the 596 Transport Group's installation immediately north and virtually connected to the 842nd's installation. These sites having had already been hit by tactical ballistic missiles, as these craters indicate the strikes from tactical ballistic and/or cruise missiles, as there were follow-up strikes from on the same sites carried out by also the Club K and YJ-18C container-based cruise missiles, just to add extra carnage to the events as they were unfolding. Two combat engineer combat companies from the total of 7 combat engineer combat companies and the headquarters and support company, which comprised the combat engineer battalion, were moving through this particular area, as by now, artillery strikes were already beginning to come in heavy against all 3 major American military installations within Beaumont, which included the Carl Pipkins Army Reserve site, 842nd Transportation Battalion site, and the 596 Transport Group site, immediately virtually connected to the 842nd Transportation Battalion site. Immediately to the north of the 596 Transport Group site was the headquarters building of the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command, which was wanted intact, as well as the personnel inside, as there were important personnel within the building in terms of their intelligence value overall. They were wanted alive for interrogation post-victory in battle. As now, the combat engineer battalion moving into the city would continue moving north as they shed off their 2 companies to seize control of the energy facilities, mostly Exxon, and also Jefferson Energy had a big footprint in this area as well. They would seize the petrochemical plants and refineries in the port area of Beaumont, as well as also the military facilities, taking the rail and port infrastructure itself intact, as the buildings could be replaced, as they could be replaced with portable and or modular or other types of buildings by the PLAN forces, as the other buildings containing American military personnel that were not deemed of any importance were viciously shelled and attacked by PLAN Marine artillery and other weapon systems in this instance, as the Combat Engineer Battalion rolled through the streets of downtown Beaumont, shedding off 2, again, of their 7 total combat engineer combat companies to seize control of the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation in the area and the energy facilities and the port of Beaumont itself. The combat engineers would engage fleeing American troops in heavy combat in this operation as they moved into and through the area. They would deploy both their armed combat robots and FPV drones in this operation, and in some instances, also their tracked disposable DJI demolition robots as well, as the Combat Engineer Battalion was also using their GSL 130 armored engineering vehicles with rocket-guided plastic explosive line-clearing charges to demolish any and all obstacles that lay in the path of the engineers as they moved into the port area of Beaumont. As the first 2 companies shed off of the battalion to seize control of the port, would now, with their very high-tech weaponry and capabilities, begin engaging fleeing American troops. Some of these squad-sized American troops would be ambushed from within buildings, like in this particular animation or illustration, essentially, where an ambush immediately is breaking out. Nobody's been hit yet, as this is the first firing going on between these 2 elements, as they would engage each other from buildings and even fight within buildings as well, as they would fight one another for control of buildings, as there were many vital structures wanted intact within the port of Beaumont, and thus certain buildings were completely off limits to destruction, but therefore would also be fought over inside of them as well as around them. The military sites, however, already having had been hit by tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes, and even certain buildings hit by demolition charges, had seen many American troops, as these attacks had begun, seek cover in fortified underground positions, whether that was in basement levels of certain structures or whether it was in sewage or drainage systems, only to emerge to fight over the rubble against their attackers as the combat engineers moved into this area to seize control of it. Even on this wooded peninsula, as the Neches River snaked through the area, creating peninsulas, as there were also lakes scattered throughout the area as well, there would even be battles, small-scale combat, fought in the wooded areas on the periphery of the port between both PLAN Marines of the Combat Engineer Battalion, as well as also American logistical troops that had fled from their embattled installation along the Neches River, the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, that is, to be exact. Sites like this would be commonplace as well, as PLAN Marines rolled into the massive parking areas of many of these sites along the port and would seek to plant their national flag, but also their party flag, which effectively was the red banner with the sickle and hammer as the CCP regime's party flag, on top of key buildings, especially the energy-related buildings in the port area. As by this point in time, all American military shipping had been outright annihilated by the combination of the YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missiles, which were state-of-the-industry, state-of-the-art, and the equally state-of-the-industry, state-of-the-art undersea loitering munitions called the U-Sun, which were the first of their type, as again, surface-based loitering munitions had been around for some time, but the U-Sun could not only attack surface ships, but also submarines as well, and therefore was a highly advanced weapon indeed in this case, as the air power by now, as 7 a.m. was effectively striking on the clock, was about to gradually return to base within the next few hours, as the Su-34 Strike Aircraft Squadron and the two J-10 fighter aircraft squadrons would, in the next few hours, jettison the last of their payloads to support the ground forces below before carrying out their RTB, as they would be gone for a total of 4 hours, as the ground crews would work, again, like race car pit crews, to get these aircraft airworthy again for their next operations, for them to return and continue to pummel the hell out of American defending ground forces. As the foot-bound U.S. troops in this area were taking to flight through the port, seeking cover in other buildings, as many of them had wisely assumed, and were correct, that the PLAN Marines had no desire to destroy the critical energy facilities. Again, there would be battles fought in this area between the advancing combat engineers and the fleeing American logistical forces moving through the area on foot. As by now, as we go to the map, in this 1.5 by 1 mile area, so it was 1.5 miles east to west by 1 mile north to south, the fighting was initiating with one PLAN Marine Combat Engineer Company moving to seize control of the 842nd Transportation Battalion site, and another Combat Engineer Company seizing control of the port and its key energy facilities in this area. As essentially on the Beaumont side of the Neches River, was the main port facilities, which also essentially included the Exxon chemical plant, the Exxon refinery, the Exxon Dock Number 5, the Sabine Ship Services, the Louis Dreyfus Energy Corporation, and across the river, the Neches River, to the north and northeast, essentially was Jefferson Energy and their affiliated sites, and Optimus Steel, which was a metal fabrication company, as this was part of their sites across the river, wherein earlier, by 6 a.m., the last three combat companies of recon troops from the recon battalion that had finished off a pocket of armed reactionary civilians had moved behind the lines of contact established in Vidor by the rest of their battalion's forces to join their company holding the I-10 bridge over the Neches River, and had moved into this industrial area containing Jefferson Energy and Optimus Steel, which was partially in this area right here. There's two squads in this area with two Lynx armored all-terrain vehicles, and one squad with their vehicles off map, having had cleared this building and were moving through this area to the north of this rail line. As the fighting in the port area was now growing more intense, the combat engineers deployed their FPV drones, four from each company in this area here, and their 5 armed combat robots in each company as well, which were right here for this company, and one here, one here, one here, one here, and one here for this company. As this was 2 combat platoons, and this is 1 combat platoon of this combat engineer company. Their headquarters platoon is off map and to the south, as this area was part of the fenced-in port area. This is a guard shack right here, and these were the Exxon facilities here, and the shipbuilding and other facilities here. And of course, there's more companies that were outside of the main port terminal area. And this, of course, was the 842nd Transport Battalion site, with slightly more just off the map, which actually connected to the 596th Transport Group's site to the north. This is a destroyed American logistical ship, having had already been sunk. And these were all commercial ships in the cyan color. This is a fishing vessel. These were all oil and cargo ships moving through the Neches River area here, as these were all 8-man squads of American military personnel seeking cover in many of these offices and other buildings. They, moving into these facilities, would end up in combat with the PLAN Marine combat engineers as they move through the area. One platoon of dismounted troops from this grouping of 2 combat platoons, as this platoon had not yet dismounted their troops as they moved north into this area, as this was the gate to the main port terminal. As they moved up and into this area, they would end up moving into this parking area and dismounting all 5 of their squads already after many of these movements had occurred, as these American squad-sized forces were moving and fleeing into these buildings. As they were moving into these buildings, they would end up being ambushed by PLAN Marines that were already inside of this refinery, as the armed combat robots held positions outside of the refinery, including moving into this parking area here. These forces moving through this area, these 2 squad-sized units, were being fired upon across the parking area as these troops were moving in from this dismounted platoon here. As this squad from this same platoon of 5 squads and this armed combat robot from their company moved along the side of the road to the north of this lake here, they would continue moving to the east, while these 2 platoons of vehicles moved north and into the chemical plant parking lot for the Exxon chemical plant. This is their Exxon Dock Number 5 right here. some troops were already being shelled by 122 millimeter artillery strikes. As again, as mentioned, artillery was coming in heavy on certain areas, whereas other areas were spared because the energy resources of the port and the port facilities and rail lines themselves were deemed too critical to destroy and thus were not targeted directly, as shells landed here and destroyed this squad-sized force trying to get out of this paved area and into this wooded area here, this lake in it. They were shelled and destroyed, this grouping of 8, while over here, massive numbers of shells were coming into the 842nd Transport Battalion site and destroyed this QRF, or Quick Reaction Force, of 4 Max Pro AMRAPs with direct hits and hits all around them. And some of these buildings had already been destroyed by demolition charges planted by the operatives, whereas others were destroyed by artillery, this motor pool being completely destroyed with fuel trucks and LMTVs in it being destroyed by artillery, this building heavily damaged. This company, as they would advance, would lay down heavy fire as well with their 30 millimeter autocannon fire coming in from their ZBDO-5 infantry fighting vehicle versions of these vehicles, as the 30 millimeter autocannon was absolutely devastating on these vehicles. They also had a 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun and a short-range HJ-73C anti-tank guided missile on a rail on the side of the vehicles. The heavily armed combat robots, the quad-legged robots, were laying down 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun fire as well. And these FPV drones, rather, were being flown in to hit groupings of personnel taking cover in rubbled positions. As, again, many of these buildings, having had been destroyed, were now being used as fighting positions as the troops emerged from underground to take up positions to engage the onrushing PLAN Marine enemy forces. As this squad and this squad, along with the armed combat robot, moved alongside this road, these two squads, having had made a mad dash for this wooded area, would be intercepted and engaged as they would bound and fire against these two squads, who would try to take positions in the thickly wooded areas to try to hold out against the bounding and covering two squads as they moved off the paved area past this power station here. This being a substation, as there was another power substation along this road in this peninsula where this combat was taking place. This being an Su-34 strike aircraft conducting an RTB, and these J-10 fighter aircraft, one here, would soon join them, as many of them by now had jettisoned their payloads, with others that still hadn't. There would still be some remaining airstrikes occurring in other parts of the battle space before the aircraft would all conduct their RTB. But for the time being, artillery was now in heavy use and in full swing, as not only were massive fire missions occurring in the town of Vidor, but also massive fire missions were occurring against the 842nd Transport Battalion site, 596 Transport Group site, and the Pipkins Army Reserve site, and also now artillery beginning to come in to support the two air assault PLAN Marine infantry companies that were holding the I-10 bridge to the southwest of the city of Beaumont, as those forces were now constantly being counterattacked by groupings of armed reactionary civilians, as more and more were trying to both flee the city but also enter the city through that area as well. And others that were passing by, seeing these enemies, simply tried to engage them. And these two companies would fight off attack after attack, counterattack after counterattack, and now, besides just the earlier air support, we're receiving sizable artillery support to continue to hold out, as this I-10 bridge was absolutely vital for the PLAN Marines to hold as it was part of the overall battle strategy to encircle American forces in the city of Beaumont. So other key bridges were also being held at this time, which included State Highway 96 Bridge in the north and the I-10 Neches River Bridge to the east, with the other bridges in the south already having had been crossed by the advancing Combat Engineer Battalion and Heavy Combined Arms Battalion on their sweep to their objectives in the city. And again, I-10 itself was an enormously important objective, and all the key nodes along the route had to be thoroughly and methodically cleared by the PLAN Marine Combat Forces. The combat engineers had begun to fight over the port by 7 a.m. Shortly after the initial fighting over the port and the 842nd Transport Battalion's installation had occurred, the 596 Transport Battalion site and the U.S. military Sealift Command site would also be assaulted by a further 3 companies that would be shed off of the Combat Engineer Battalion as they moved north into this area. As the first 2 companies were shed off to take 842nd Transport Battalion site and the port facilities. The remaining portions of this battle in more detail will be covered in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion. As in the next installation, the battle for control of the port, the 842nd Transportation Battalion site installation, as well as the neighboring 596 Transportation Battalion or transport group site and the U.S. Military Sealift Command headquarters will be covered next.